Sunset Boulevard. Now, to topple Ferdinand Marcos in 1986, a widow and a former senator had to unite. Cory Aquino, of course, was the widow of Benigno Aquino Jr., who had in turn been a childhood friend of Salvador H. Laurel. Both Ninoy and Doy had been driven in their political careers by a desire to vindicate their fathers. On December 11, 1941, in what's now the campus of PSBA in Quezon City, this cabinet meeting took place under the shade of a mango tree. It was the last cabinet meeting of the Commonwealth government prior to its evacuation to Corregidor and then exile. During the meeting, the man on the right, Quezon, instructed the man in the middle, this guy here, the guy with glasses, Jose P. Laurel, to stay in Manila and cooperate with the Japanese to help protect the public. Now, the officials you see here, photographed during a visit to the Emperor of Japan in 1943, Jose P. Laurel, George Vargas, and Benigno Aquino Sr., ended up hated by many of their countrymen because they stayed in government to do what they could to act as a buffer between the Japanese and the public. Ninoy Aquino, for one, became a daring politician, a man in a hurry, because of the trauma of seeing his father become so unpopular during the war and then only end up dying of a heart attack during a boxing match before he could resume his political career after the war. Ninoy vowed that he'd be so successful, his father's memory would be vindicated. Now, he started off as a journalist covering the Korean War and then as a bridger of divides, including helping to convince Hukbalhap Military Supremo Luis Taruk to surrender to the authorities. In the 50s and the 60s and into the early 70s, he was a political whiz kid, a risk-taker, mounting a meteoric political career that always carried with it two goals: to pursue his own ambitions and to make his success a crowning achievement for his father's memory. Now, last month, the country got a crash course in how it all went wrong when martial law was imposed. But by ending his normal political career, ironically, martial law made Ninoy a better man and a statesman and no longer a politician. Now, in this letter, Ninoy penned a revealing letter to his son, Benigno III, or Noynoy. Aquino explained his principled and no longer merely partisan opposition to Marcos, and also wrote these lines to his son, and let me quote, "Your grandfather, my father, was also imprisoned by the Americans because he loved his people more than the Americans who colonized us," Ninoy wrote, adding, quote, "he was finally vindicated," end quote. Now, Ninoy was referring to the release of his father from jail and how charges in the People's Court to try officials for treason didn't prosper. But Ninoy was haunted by the lingering unpopularity of his father, and it drove him to assert his own political principles as part of a long family history of principled opposition, and culminating, of course, in the crowning glory of any leader to die for his country, which is what Ninoy did on August 21, 1983, the anniversary of the Plaza Miranda bombing that Ninoy had narrowly escaped because he showed up late. Now, just as Ninoy bore his family history heavily on his shoulders, Doy Laurel too had seen his father imprisoned by the Americans and charged with treason by his countrymen for heading the puppet republic established by the Japanese. Now, Laurel's wartime role made him a target for assassination attempts by the guerrillas, and Doy knew his father had sought political rehabilitation by means of the other kind of vindication politicians seek: election. Not just infrastructure, but the well-ordered political establishment had been destroyed by World War II. Men like Teofilo Sison, whom you see here and who was our first Secretary of National Defense, like Laurel and Aquino, had faced charges of treason, and some had never recovered politically. Sison, for one, because he was actually convicted of treason, though later pardoned. Aquino, for another, because he died before he could resume his political career. Now, Laurel, for his part, would try to make a comeback. But hanging over everything was a question of collaboration. In the 1946 elections, Osmeña accused Rojas of collaboration, while Rojas accused Osmeña of being old and out of touch. Rojas barnstormed the country. Osmeña made only one speech. Guess who lost? And yet, crowning his career with his greatest defeat became for Sergio Osmeña his greatest victory. And this suggests another kind of rehabilitation, a rare one for politicians who too often are considered only as good as their ability to win elections. Here's the late Teodoro M. Locsin Sr. telling us why Osmeña could view defeat as a victory, and has gone down in history as a man who was ennobled by his defeats. Quote, "There is another kind of defeat, And it's a rare one, rare in history and most rare in political history, for politics seems to bring out the worst, the meanest in men. It's more than just honorable, it's glorious, and that is defeat from self-denial, to lose when one might have won out of a sense of high purpose. Such was the defeat of President Sergio Osmeña in the 1946 presidential election." End quote. Rojas himself, accused of collaboration, had viewed his victory as a vindication. His successor, Elpidio Quirino, who'd lost his wife and some of his children to the Japanese, in turn brought up the collaboration issue against Laurel, who'd been granted an amnesty by Rojas in 1948. The 1949 elections had Quirino, a genuine victim of the Japanese occupation, facing off against Laurel, who'd been puppet president under the Japanese, and who lost in a famously bitter and controversial election that year. Laurel, having lost his bid for the presidency, decided to run instead for the Senate because he felt he still needed a popular mandate to settle once and for all his true standing before the people. When Laurel was successfully elected senator, he could rest easily, having proven he'd been rehabilitated by the public. And so he gave way in 1953 to Ramon Magsaysay to ensure not only one opposition candidate would face off against Quirino, but also that when Magsaysay ended up defeating Quirino, in a sense, it would vindicate Laurel's 1949 loss too. Fast forward 40 years to the rise to the presidency of Joseph Ejercito Estrada. Now, Estrada had been mayor of San Juan for 2 decades when he was removed after the EDSA revolution, purged local governments of Marcos-era officials. Now, this forced Estrada to train his sights on higher office to vindicate himself. But this would bring him up against his own vice president, who, a mere 3.5 years after their inauguration, would succeed Estrada. Now, aside from his own legal problems, Estrada's premature removal from office triggered in him the urge to find political vindication and achieve a kind of historical rehabilitation. He did this by means of 2 political proxies: his son, who was elected to the Senate, and his wife, with the former First Lady also being elected to the Senate. But this, in turn, has left Estrada still wanting an additional vindication to return to the presidency, although it's complicated by his having accepted a pardon from his successor, the president. Now, whether they will end up tied to each other, not by friendly obligations like this photo from Cebu just recently, but by a web of legal requirements because of the pardon, remains to be seen. And this brings us to what we'll be talking about further tonight. Presidents, whether mere politicians or actual statesmen, are often haunted by their own pasts. Sometimes they seek the low road or the high road to seek vindication, even after their terms. Sometimes all they want is to be rehabilitated after a period of disgrace. And sometimes either of these yearnings becomes a filial obligation. So join me for the Explainer Dialogues, where we'll ask, is a Marcos rehabilitation underway? And what about the Arroyo one? Is it too soon to ask? I'm Manolo, Quezon, and this has been The Explainer.